I've always enjoyed solo camping. There's something peaceful about being out in the wild, away from people, away from the noise of everyday life. Some call it dangerous, but to me, it's the safest place to be. No distractions, no stress, just survival and the open wilderness. Last fall, I took a trip deep into the forests of northern Washington. I wanted to challenge myself, push farther than I had before. I spent weeks planning, studying maps, making sure I knew the terrain. The plan was simple: hike in about 15 miles from my truck, set up camp near a small lake I had found on the map, and spend 4 nights completely off-grid. The first day was uneventful. The hike was tough. Dense forest, uneven ground, a few steep inclines that had my legs burning. But the deeper I went, the more I felt that familiar sense of calm. Out here, nothing mattered but the next step, the next task. By late afternoon, I reached the lake. It was beautiful, clear water, surrounded by thick pines, and no sign that anyone had been here before. No trails, no campsites, no fire rings. Exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent near the water, gathered firewood, and cooked a quick meal as the sun started to set. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. As darkness settled, I felt that deep sense of satisfaction I always got from being out here. Alone, safe. Then, sometime around midnight, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me. It was the silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I listened, barely breathing. The usual sounds of the forest, bugs, wind, the distant creak of trees were gone. It was as if the entire world had stopped. I slowly unzipped my sleeping bag, straining to hear anything. Then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard it. A single, deliberate snap, like someone stepping on a branch. My blood went cold. I reached for my knife, my heart hammering. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows. I strained my eyes, scanning the darkness beyond the glow of the embers. Nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, barely moving, barely breathing. Eventually, the normal sounds of the forest returned. The wind, the insects, the distant rustling of trees. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe just my imagination. Still, I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Morning came, and with it, a false sense of safety. Everything felt normal again. The sun filtering through the trees, the gentle sound of water lapping at the shore. I forced myself to shake it off. I had come out here for peace, not paranoia. I spent most of the day exploring. I followed the creek up into the hills, fished for a while, even found a few old animal tracks. But the whole time, I couldn't shake this feeling, like I wasn't alone. That evening, I made sure to collect extra firewood. I wanted a big fire tonight, something to push back the dark. As the sun set, I sat with my back against a tree, watching the flames. I forced myself to relax, to enjoy the quiet. Then, just as the last light faded from the sky, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, leading from the trees. Bare footprints. My fire crackled, sending flickering light across the ground. The prints were fresh, the edges still sharp in the dirt. They led from the tree line to just a few feet from my tent. And then they disappeared, like whoever had made them had stopped. Stood there, watching. I scanned the darkness, my knife in my hand. The firelight only reached so far, leaving the forest beyond in deep shadow. I listened. Silence. No wind. No insects. Just like last night. I didn't move. I didn't blink. Then, from somewhere out in the trees, I heard it. Breathing. Slow. Heavy. I gripped my knife so hard my knuckles ached. I couldn't see anything past the fire's edge, but I could feel it. Someone was out there, watching, standing just beyond the light. I forced myself to stay calm. If I panicked, I'd make mistakes. I needed to think. I kept the fire going, forcing myself to act normal. If they wanted to come closer, they'd have to do it in the open. Hours passed. The breathing stopped. The forest came back to life. Slowly, like it had been holding its breath along with me. I didn't sleep. The first light, I packed my gear. I wasn't staying another night. I moved fast, hiking back toward my truck without stopping. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone just behind me, but I never saw anything. By the time I reached the old service road, I was drenched in sweat. My truck was right where I left it. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then I saw it, on the hood of my truck. A single, perfect handprint, smudged into the dust. A bare handprint, fresh. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I forced myself not to look back. I haven't been back to that part of the forest since. I don't know who was out there, or what they wanted. I only know one thing. They were watching me, and they were patient. I've been camping alone for years. Started as a way to clear my head. No distractions, no people, just me and the woods. Over time, it became something I looked forward to. Some people are afraid of being alone in the wilderness, but I always felt safer out there than I ever did in a crowded city. That changed after my last trip. I had planned a 3-night solo trip deep in the mountains of Idaho, well off any marked trails. I wanted to push myself, see how far I could get from civilization. I studied maps for weeks, picking a spot near a small lake that looked completely untouched. I packed light, took my gear, and drove out to an old service road where I parked my truck. The hike in was long, about 12 miles through rough terrain. No trails, just a mix of dense pine and open ridgelines. It was exhausting, but I made it by mid-afternoon. The place was even better than I had imagined. A small, clear lake tucked into the trees, the water completely still. No sign that anyone had ever been there. No footprints, no fire pits, nothing. I set up camp near the shoreline, made a fire, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the trees, the woods around me started to change. The wind rustled through the pines, the water lapped softly at the shore, and a distant owl called through the silence. It was perfect. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I noticed something strange. The forest had gone quiet. It happened all at once. No crickets, no birds, no rustling leaves. Just total, complete silence. I've spent enough time in the woods to know that's never a good sign. It usually means a predator is nearby, something big enough to make everything else stop moving. A bear, maybe. A mountain lion. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees. Nothing. Just the endless stretch of forest beyond the firelight. Then I heard it. A branch snapping. Not the soft crackle of settling wood. This was different. It was weight. A footstep. I turned, aiming my flashlight toward the sound, my pulse hammering. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I saw were more trees, more shadows. I listened. Nothing. I stood there for a while, waiting. The silence stretched on, thick and unnatural. Then, slowly, the normal sounds of the forest started to return. The insects, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the wind. I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe just a deer moving through the brush. Still, I kept my knife close when I crawled into my tent that night. I woke up early, the sunlight filtering through the trees. I stepped out of my tent, stretched, and looked around. Then I saw them. Footprints, bare footprints, leading from the trees to my tent. My stomach dropped. They were fresh, the edges still sharp in the dirt. Someone had been here. Someone had walked right up to my tent while I was sleeping. I scanned the woods, my pulse pounding in my ears. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just some lost hiker. Maybe they saw my fire and wandered over. But that didn't make sense. There were no trails out here, and who hikes barefoot? I needed to know if they were still around. I followed the footprints back toward the trees. They led deep into the woods before disappearing into the undergrowth. No signs of a campsite, no gear, just the prints, like someone had walked up to my tent in the middle of the night and then vanished. I forced myself to think logically. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. The feeling of being watched was stronger now. I spent the day exploring, trying to shake the unease. I hiked around the lake, fished for a while, kept my hands busy, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already sinking. I rebuilt my fire, cooked dinner, and tried to relax. Then, just as the last light faded from the sky, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, standing at the edge of the firelight, still watching. I froze, my hand tightening around my knife. The figure didn't move. I forced myself to focus, trying to make out any details. The firelight flickered, making the shadows shift. I could barely see it, just the outline of a person. No clothes, no shoes, just pale skin blending into the darkness. Then, slowly, they stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. The first light, I packed my gear. I wasn't going to stay another night. I moved fast, hiking back toward my truck without stopping. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again. But I never saw anything. By the time I reached the old service road, I was drenched in sweat. My truck was parked exactly where I left it. I let out a shaky breath, dropped my pack, and reached for the door handle. Then I stopped. There was something on my truck. A single, perfect handprint, smudged into the dust. A bare handprint, fresh. My breath caught in my throat. I climbed into the truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove away. I don't camp alone anymore. I always liked camping alone. It was my way of escaping everything: work, my phone, people. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. It was peaceful, but this time it wasn't. I had picked a spot deep in the national forest, about an hour's drive from the nearest town. I parked my truck on an old dirt road, grabbed my pack, and hiked about 2 miles into the woods. The spot I chose was near a small creek, surrounded by thick pines. It felt secluded, safe. The first day was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and built a fire before sunset. As the sun dipped below the treetops, I cooked a simple meal, just some beans and rice. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with sounds. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant rustling of animals moving through the brush. All normal, all comforting. That night I slept hard, the kind of sleep that only comes when you're completely exhausted. The second day, I hiked deeper into the woods, following the creek upstream. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just exploring. The forest was thick, but the creek made it easy to navigate. After a few hours, I stopped to eat, then turned back toward camp. That's when I noticed something. A footprint, not mine. It was in the damp earth near the water's edge. A heavy boot print, deeper than mine, like whoever left it was carrying something heavy. It wasn't fresh, maybe a day or two old, but still, it unsettled me. I hadn't seen anyone else out here. No signs of camps, no smoke from other fires. Just me. Or at least that's what I had thought. I walked back to camp faster than before, scanning the woods more than usual. But everything was still. No movement. No sounds beyond the normal ones. By the time I got back, the sun was setting, and I told myself I was being paranoid. It was public land, after all. Someone could have passed through before me. No reason to worry. That night, I sat by the fire longer than I usually did. I wasn't scared, just more aware, more alert. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind through the trees, I noticed it. Eventually, I forced myself to sleep. It was the middle of the night when I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to embers, and everything was pitch black outside my tent. But something felt off, the kind of feeling you get when someone is watching you. I lay still, listening, and then I heard it. A slow, steady sound. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not a deer or a raccoon. Something bigger, heavier. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped, maybe 20 feet from my tent. The silence stretched. I stayed completely still, listening, waiting. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away. Slowly, deliberately, they faded into the forest until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I was exhausted, but I told myself it was nothing. Probably an animal, maybe a bear. The sound had felt too deliberate, but I needed a rational explanation. Otherwise, I'd lose my mind. Still, I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up quickly, stuffing my tent and gear into my pack, barely stopping to eat. I wanted to get back to my truck before anything else happened. I didn't see any tracks near my campsite, but the ground was hard. If someone had been there, I wouldn't have known. The hike back felt longer than before. Every sound made my skin crawl. Every shadow between the trees felt like it was hiding something. I pushed forward, walking faster than I normally would. Then I saw it. Tarp. A dirty, weathered tarp, stretched between two trees just off the trail. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen it on my way in. Someone had set up camp here, not far from mine. I wanted to keep walking. I wanted to pretend I hadn't seen it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer. The campsite was a mess. Empty cans, a half-burned log in a fire pit, a few pieces of clothing scattered on the ground. No tent, no sign of who had been staying there. But what really made my skin crawl was the smell. Rotting, sour, like meat left out in the sun too long. I didn't look for the source. I didn't want to know. I turned and walked as fast as I could toward my truck. I made it back without seeing anyone. The truck was right where I left it. I threw my gear in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, just at the tree line, something moved. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I hit the main road, and I didn't look back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know if they were watching me the whole time. But I do know one thing. I'm never camping alone again. I always loved being outdoors. The quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of being away from everything. There was something about being in the middle of nowhere that made the world feel simpler. No emails, no traffic, no noise, just nature. That's why I went camping alone whenever I could. I never thought twice about it. But after what happened, I don't think I'll ever go again. It was mid-September when I decided to take a short solo camping trip. The weather was perfect, cool, but not too cold. The kind of air that smelled crisp, like leaves and dirt, not like the exhaust of 1,000 cars. I had picked a spot deep in a national forest, far from any major roads. It wasn't a popular place. The closest town was about an hour's drive away, and even then, it was just a small collection of gas stations and diners. I liked it that way. I parked my truck on an old dirt path, threw on my backpack, and hiked a couple of miles into the woods. The spot I chose was near a small, slow-moving stream. The trees were thick, the undergrowth was dense, and there was no sign that anyone had been here recently. No footprints, no cigarette butts, no empty beer cans. Just me and the wild. I set up my tent on a patch of flat ground, cleared some leaves, and built a small fire. The first evening was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal, just some rice and canned chicken, then sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. Birds settling in for the night, the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. All normal. All the kind of noises I had heard 100 times before. I went to bed early, exhausted from the hike. I fell asleep fast. At some point in the night, I woke up. It wasn't a noise that woke me up. It was the kind of waking where your body just knows something isn't right. I lay still, listening. The fire outside had burned down to embers. The woods were quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I closed my eyes, trying to go back to sleep. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate snap of a branch. Close. I held my breath. Another snap. Something or someone was moving maybe 20 feet from my tent. The steps were slow, careful, not like an animal crashing through the brush. It was measured, cautious. I stayed perfectly still, straining my ears. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. I lay there for what felt like forever, heart pounding, skin prickling with cold sweat. Nothing. After a while, I convinced myself it was probably a deer, maybe a coyote, something wandering through the woods. Animals get curious. It wasn't unusual. I must have drifted back to sleep at some point because when I woke up again, it was morning. Sunlight filtered through the trees, making everything feel normal again. Safe. Still, I checked around my campsite. There were no tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. Maybe I had imagined it. I brushed it off, made some instant coffee over the fire, and planned out my day. I wanted to explore a little, maybe follow the stream to see where it led. I packed a small bag with some water and a snack, then headed out. The forest was dense but beautiful. Sunlight streamed through the canopy in patches, dappling the ground in gold and shadow. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the distant gurgle of the stream. I hiked for a few miles, enjoying the solitude. Then I found something strange. A tree. First, it just looked like any other tree. But as I got closer, I saw that the bark had been stripped away in long, jagged claw marks. Deep ones, too deep for a deer. I bent down and saw something at the base of the tree. A small pile of bones. They were picked clean. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. There were no large predators in this area. No bears, no mountain lions. At least none that were supposed to be here. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had hunted an animal and left the bones. Maybe the claw marks were from an old, half-rotted tree falling and scratching another on the way down. There was always a logical explanation, but still, something about it unsettled me. I decided to turn back. As I made my way back toward camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't like I heard anything. No footsteps, no branches snapping, just a feeling. That creeping sensation that someone is watching you. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there, just trees. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was already dipping low in the sky. I added more wood to the fire, trying to shake off the unease. I forced myself to eat, even though I didn't have much of an appetite. As the fire crackled, I kept my eyes on the trees. The feeling never went away. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me sit up, heart pounding. I clutched the knife I always kept with me, staring at the dark outline of my tent. Nothing happened, not until just before dawn. I had finally dozed off when I woke to a sound. Not footsteps this time, something else. Breathing, close, right outside my tent. Slow, deep breaths. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My body was frozen, every muscle locked in place. The breathing was steady, slow, almost deliberate. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I waited, barely daring to breathe myself. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Then, as the first light of dawn crept through the fabric of my tent, I finally moved. I unzipped the tent as slowly and quietly as I could. Gripping my knife so tight my hand ached. I peered outside. The fire had burned low again, casting everything in flickering shadows. The trees stood still. Nothing moved, but something had been there. I saw them, footprints, not mine, leading up to my tent, and then leading away. I don't remember packing up. I don't remember the hike back to my truck. All I remember is running until my legs burned, until my lungs ached, until I saw my truck through the trees. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped out of there without looking back. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know this. I wasn't supposed to be there, and whatever it was, it knew I was alone. I've always loved the outdoors. Ever since I was a kid, I felt more at home in the woods than I ever did in the city. Something about the quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of being away from everything. It was peaceful. That's why, whenever I had time off work, I went camping alone. I never thought twice about it. But after what happened last fall, I don't think I'll ever do it again. It was mid-October. The leaves had started turning, and the air had that perfect crispness, cool enough for a jacket but not yet freezing. It was my favorite time of year to camp. I had a 3-day weekend coming up, and I planned to spend it deep in the national forest, in a spot I had found years ago. It was far from any main trails, a place where I could go days without seeing another person. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, enough food and water for a few days. I always packed light. I wasn't one of those people who brought a whole kitchen into the woods. Just the basics. The drive out was long, mostly dirt roads winding through thick trees. I didn't mind. The farther I got from civilization, the better I felt. I parked at a small pull-off spot and grabbed my pack. The hike in was about 5 miles, mostly uphill. It wasn't easy, but I had done it plenty of times before. I knew the way. The trees were dense, the ground covered in fallen leaves, the smell of earth and pine filling the air. By the time I reached my usual spot, the sun was starting to dip. The clearing was just how I remembered it. Flat ground, a few large rocks perfect for sitting, a small creek running nearby. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and built a fire. As the sky darkened, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal and listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the occasional rustling of leaves, the faint trickle of water in the creek. Everything felt normal. I went to bed early, exhausted from the hike. I fell asleep fast. I don't know what woke me up. 1 second, I was asleep. The next, I was wide awake, staring at the fabric of my tent, my heart pounding. I listened. Nothing. The fire outside had burned down to embers. The woods were silent. Too silent. I stayed still, straining my ears. Then I heard it. A soft crunch. Leaves. Something was moving. My whole body tensed. It wasn't an animal. I knew that right away. Animals move quickly, carelessly. They don't care about making noise. This was different. The steps were slow, deliberate. A few steps, then silence. Then another. I held my breath. My knife was in my pack, just out of reach. My gun was in the truck, 5 miles away. I hadn't thought I'd need it. I lay there, frozen, listening. The steps circled my tent. Not close, maybe 20, 30 feet away. Moving slowly. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, but my gut told me otherwise. I stayed awake for hours, listening. At some point, the sounds stopped. I don't know when. Eventually, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the trees. I got up slowly, my muscles stiff from lying still so long. I stepped out of my tent and looked around. Nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing to prove that someone or something had been there. I told myself I imagined it. Maybe a deer. Maybe I was just on edge from being alone. I spent the day hiking, exploring further down the creek. The woods were beautiful, peaceful. By the time I got back to camp, I felt normal again. That night, I built a bigger fire. It made me feel safer. I stayed up later, staring into the flames, listening to the forest. It was past midnight when I finally crawled into my tent. I didn't sleep long. The sound was different this time. Not footsteps, breathing, slow, deep, right outside my tent. I didn't move. The breathing was steady, heavy, too close. I could hear every inhale, every exhale. Then silence. I waited, my whole body tense, heart pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there could hear it. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around my tent, circling. I stayed perfectly still. The steps stopped, right at the entrance of my tent. I held my breath, gripping my knife. Then, the zipper. It moved, just a fraction of an inch. Not fast, not like someone yanking it open. Slow. A test. I don't know what happened. Maybe the fire outside shifted. Maybe a branch snapped somewhere in the woods. Something made a noise. The zipper stopped. Silence. Then, the footsteps moved away. Slow at first, then faster, fading into the trees. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. When the first light of dawn crept into my tent, I finally unzipped it and looked outside. The fire was still smoldering. My bag was where I left it, but there, in the dirt, were footprints. Big, deep, not mine. They led up to my tent, and then away. I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just grabbed my stuff and started walking. fast, then jogging, then running. I didn't stop until I saw my truck through the trees. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, locked the doors, and tore out of there, not looking back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing. I wasn't alone in those woods. And whoever was out there, they wanted me to know it. I've always loved camping. There's something about being out in the wilderness that makes everything else seem unimportant. No noise, no deadlines, no people, just the quiet sounds of nature. I've camped alone plenty of times, and I never thought twice about it. Some people get nervous being out in the woods by themselves, but I always found it peaceful. I knew how to handle myself. I knew how to keep a fire going, how to store food properly, how to stay safe. That's why I didn't think twice about taking one last solo trip before the summer ended. I picked a spot deep in the mountains, about 10 miles from the nearest road. No trails, no campsites, just pure wilderness. I wanted to be completely alone. I parked my truck near an old, overgrown path and hiked in. The deeper I went, the quieter the world became. By late afternoon, I found the perfect spot, a small clearing near a creek, surrounded by thick pines. I set up camp, gathered firewood, and cooked a quick meal as the sun dipped below the trees. The fire crackled, the stream bubbled softly, and the wind rustled through the branches. It was perfect. Then, just as I was finishing my food, I noticed something. The woods had gone silent. At first, I didn't think much of it. But after a few minutes, I realized just how unnatural it was. No crickets, no birds, no rustling in the underbrush. Just dead silence. That's never a good sign. When the forest goes quiet, it usually means something is nearby. Predator, a mountain lion, maybe a bear. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the tree line. Nothing, just the endless stretch of forest beyond the reach of the beam. I listened. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard it, a branch snapping, not a random crackling from a falling pine cone. Clear, deliberate snap. I turned toward the sound, my pulse hammering in my ears. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows, making it hard to see past the first row of trees. I stayed still, gripping my knife. Then, another sound. Footsteps. Soft, slow, careful. I swept my flashlight toward the noise, my heart pounding. Nothing. I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm. It was probably just a deer, maybe a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. After a few minutes, the normal sounds of the forest slowly returned. The insects, the rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl. I convinced myself I was overreacting. Still, I kept my knife within reach when I crawled into my tent that night. I woke up at first light, feeling uneasy. I stepped out of my tent, stretched, and looked around. That's when I saw them. Footprints, bare footprints, leading from the tree line to my tent. My stomach dropped. I crouched down, staring at the prints. They were fresh, the edges still sharp, not distorted by wind or rain. Someone had been here. Someone had walked right up to my tent while I was sleeping. I looked around, scanning the trees. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than before. I told myself it was just some lost hiker. Maybe they saw my fire and wandered over. Maybe they left when they realized someone was already camping here. But I didn't believe that. I had hiked 10 miles into the wilderness. There were no trails out here. No reason for anyone else to be this deep in the woods. And besides, who hikes barefoot? I forced myself to stay calm. I packed my gear, made a quick breakfast, and decided to spend the day exploring. I needed to clear my head. I followed the creek for a few miles, moving carefully, scanning the ground for more footprints. Nothing. By late afternoon, I headed back to camp. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees. I rebuilt my fire, cooked another meal, and tried to shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. As darkness fell, I kept my flashlight close. Then, just as the last light faded from the sky, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, standing at the edge of the firelight. Still, watching. I froze, my hand tightening around my knife. The figure didn't move. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear the crackling fire. I forced myself to focus, trying to make out any details. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it stepped back into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. The first light, I packed my gear. I wasn't going to stay another night. I moved fast, hiking back toward my truck without stopping. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that figure lurking between the trees. But I never saw anything. After hours of hiking, I finally reached the logging road where I had left my truck. I let out a shaky breath. Then I saw it, on the hood of my truck. A single, perfect handprint, smudged into the dust. A bare handprint, fresh. I climbed in, locked the doors, and drove without stopping. I don't camp alone anymore. I've always been an outdoors guy. Something about being alone in nature clears my mind in a way nothing else does. No noise, no stress, no people. Just the trees, the wind, and the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt. I had been camping solo for years, and I thought I had seen it all. Black bears sniffing around my tent, sudden storms turning trails into rivers, even the occasional weirdo lurking too close to my campsite. But nothing prepared me for what happened on my last trip. I had planned a 3-night solo trip deep in the backwoods of northern Montana. The area wasn't a designated campsite, just a stretch of untouched forest with no trails, no ranger stations, and no people for miles. I liked it that way. I had picked the spot after studying satellite maps, looking for a clearing near water. I parked my truck on the side of an old logging road, grabbed my pack, and hiked in about 8 miles. The deeper I went, the quieter the world became. After a few hours, I reached the spot. A perfect clearing by a slow-moving stream, surrounded by tall pines. It was exactly what I was looking for. I set up camp, got a fire going, and cooked a quick meal. As the sun dipped below the trees, I sat by the fire, listening to the wind rustling through the branches. The air was crisp, the smell of pine strong. Then, just as I was finishing my dinner, I noticed something. The forest had gone silent. At first, I didn't think much of it. But after a minute or two, I realized just how unnatural it was. No crickets, no rustling in the bushes. Even the wind seemed to have died. It was complete and total silence. I've been camping enough to know that usually means one thing: a predator is nearby. A mountain lion, maybe, or a bear. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees. Nothing. Just the endless stretch of forest beyond the reach of the beam. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. It wasn't loud, but in the dead silence, it sounded like a gunshot. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding. The fire cast long, flickering shadows, making it hard to see past the first few rows of trees. I stayed still, waiting, listening. Nothing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just an animal moving through the brush. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. Still, I kept my knife close when I crawled into my tent that night. I woke up early, the forest bright and alive again. The strange silence from the night before was gone. Birds were chirping, squirrels were darting between branches. I shook off my unease, ate a quick breakfast, and decided to explore the area. I spent most of the day hiking, following the stream deeper into the woods. The terrain was rough, but I liked the challenge. I even found some fresh deer tracks, which reassured me that whatever had passed by my campsite the night before hadn't scared off the wildlife. By late afternoon, I made my way back to camp, tired but satisfied. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden glow over the trees. I got a fire going, cooked dinner, and sat back, feeling more relaxed than the night before. Then, just as the last light faded from the sky, I saw something that made my stomach drop. About 20 feet from my campsite, scratched into the bark of a tree, were 4 long, deep gouges. They were fresh. I walked up to them, running my fingers over the grooves. They were too deep to be from an animal. Bears scratch trees, but their marks are wider, rougher. These were long, straight, and deliberate. A cold feeling crept up my spine. Someone had been here. I turned, scanning the trees. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than before. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the scratches had been there for a while, and I just hadn't noticed them before. Still, I didn't like it. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, listening. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it again. Snap. A single, deliberate footstep, closer than before. I didn't move. I just listened. My whole body tensed. Then another. Crunch. Something or someone was out there. I grabbed my knife, my flashlight, and stood up slowly. I shined the light toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I saw were more trees, more shadows. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of the light. Too far to make out details, but close enough to know it wasn't an animal. It was a person, standing completely still, watching me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, gripping my knife so tight my knuckles ached. Then, without a sound, the figure stepped back, melting into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. The first light, I packed my gear. I had planned to stay another night, but I wasn't about to stick around to see who or what was out there. The hike back to my truck felt longer than before. Every sound made my heart race. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. Finally, I reached the old logging road. My truck was right where I left it. I threw my pack in the bed, climbed in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm myself. Then I saw it, on the hood of my truck, for deep scratches just like the ones on the tree. I turned the key, slammed the gas, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I don't camp alone anymore. I've always been an outdoors person. Something about the quiet of the wilderness, the fresh air, the feeling of being away from everything. I loved it. I never minded going alone either. In fact, I preferred it. No distractions, no small talk. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. This trip was no different. I had planned to spend a few nights out in a remote area, far from any marked trails. I had done my research, studied the maps, checked the weather. Everything looked perfect. No storms in the forecast, no major wildlife activity reported. Just a quiet, peaceful escape. I parked my truck at the closest access point and hiked in about 8 miles. The deeper into the woods I went, the better I felt. No cell service, no people. Just the sounds of birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. By late afternoon, I found the perfect spot. A small clearing near a slow-moving stream, flat ground, plenty of firewood nearby. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and cooked a quick meal. As the sun dipped below the trees, I leaned back against a fallen log, watching the flames dance, feeling completely at peace. Then I noticed something. The woods had gone silent. I've camped enough to know that's never a good sign. The usual background noise, the chirping of insects, the rustling of small animals was gone. It wasn't just quiet. It was silent. I sat up, suddenly alert. My mind ran through the possibilities. Predator, maybe, a bear or a mountain lion. But they usually don't care much about humans unless you get too close. And they don't make the whole forest go silent. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the tree line. Nothing but darkness. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that, the forest swallowed everything. I listened. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn back to the fire, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, like something tapping on wood. Tap, tap, tap. It was distant, barely loud enough to hear, but definitely there. Steady, deliberate, not the random sounds of nature. I tried to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it echoed strangely through the trees. My gut told me to ignore it, to stay put, but my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my knife and my flashlight and stepped away from the fire, just a few feet. I wasn't about to go wandering into the dark, but I needed to see if something was out there. The second I moved, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stood there, gripping my knife, my ears straining for any sound. Nothing moved. No wind, no animals, no footsteps. Just that thick, heavy silence pressing down on everything. I slowly backed toward my fire, my heart pounding. Once I was close enough to the warmth of the flames, I forced myself to sit down. Whatever it was, I wasn't going to let it scare me into making a mistake. But I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, the forest sounded normal again. Birds were chirping. The wind rustled through the trees. The stream gurgled softly. It almost felt like I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. I checked the perimeter of my campsite. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints, no broken branches. But I still felt uneasy. I debated cutting the trip short, but I hated the idea of leaving over something I couldn't explain. I convinced myself it had just been a coincidence. Maybe a tree creaking in the wind, maybe an animal making an odd sound. By midday, I had almost convinced myself to relax. I spent the afternoon fishing in the stream, cooking over the fire, enjoying the solitude. Then, just as the sun was starting to dip, I noticed something. A tree, about 30 feet from my campsite. Yesterday, I was sure it had been normal, just another tree, but now it had something on it. Carvings, long, thin scratches running vertically down the bark. Deep enough to be noticeable, but not from an animal. Not claw marks. They were too straight, too even. I walked up to it, running my fingers over the grooves. They were fresh. The raw wood beneath the bark was still pale, not yet darkened by exposure. Someone had done this recently. I turned, scanning the trees. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than before. I didn't hesitate this time. I grabbed my gear and packed everything up. I wasn't going to wait around to see what happened next. The hike back to my truck was long, and the whole time, I felt like something was behind me. I never saw anything, never heard anything, but the feeling never left. Finally, I reached my truck. I threw my pack in the bed, climbed in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, telling myself I had made the right choice. Then, just before I started the engine, I saw it. On the hood of my truck, another carving. Thin, deep scratches, running in the same vertical pattern as the ones on the tree. Fresh. I turned the key, floored it out of there, and didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I don't go camping alone anymore. I've always loved camping. The fresh air, the quietness, the feeling of being completely away from everything. No phone calls, no emails, no traffic. Just the woods, the fire, and the night sky. I had done plenty of solo camping trips before, and I always preferred them over going with a group. There's something about being completely alone in the wilderness that makes everything feel more real. This time, I had picked a spot deep in the forest, farther than I usually go. It was an area I had never explored before, but I had checked the maps and planned everything out. A small clearing by a creek, surrounded by thick trees. It was perfect. I parked my truck as close as I could to the trail and hiked the rest of the way in. It took me almost an hour to get to the spot, but once I did, I knew I had chosen well. The clearing was just big enough for my tent and a fire, and the creek nearby meant I had fresh water. I set up camp, got a fire going, and cooked a quick meal. As the sun started to set, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the sounds of the forest. Birds, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, but as the night got darker, I started to notice something. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping insects, the rustling in the underbrush, started to fade. It wasn't immediate, but after a while, I realized it had gone completely silent. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that when the forest goes quiet, something is nearby. Predator, maybe, a bear or a mountain lion. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees. Nothing, just darkness beyond the reach of the beam. I listened carefully, trying to pick up any sound, but there was nothing. No wind, no movement, just complete, unnatural silence. Then I heard it, a single, deliberate snap of a branch. It wasn't the random crackling of leaves under a small animal. It was a clear, sharp snap, like someone had stepped on it. I swung the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. I kept it there for a few seconds, waiting. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I told myself it was probably just a deer. They can move surprisingly quietly, but sometimes they do step on things. Still, I felt uneasy. I had that feeling you get when someone is watching you, even though you can't see them. I stood there for a long time, waiting, listening, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I shook it off and went back to the fire. The sounds of the forest hadn't returned, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. I always kept my knife close when I camped alone, and tonight was no different. I placed it beside my sleeping bag within easy reach just in case. Sleep didn't come easily. The silence outside felt oppressive, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Every little noise made me jump. The rustling of the tent fabric, the crackling of the dying fire. Then I heard something else. A soft, deliberate shuffling. Not an animal scurrying, but something moving carefully through the underbrush. I held my breath, straining to hear. It was close, maybe 10, 15 feet away, moving slowly, deliberately. Then it stopped. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just lay there, gripping the knife, staring at the tent fabric, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed. Nothing. Finally, after what felt like forever, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a raccoon. Maybe my imagination. I didn't know. But eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up as soon as the sun started to rise. The first thing I did was check around the campsite. Nothing seemed disturbed. My food was untouched, the fire pit was as I left it. But when I walked a few feet away from my tent, I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I checked. My boot prints were there, but these were different. Barefoot. Bigger than mine. The prints were deep, meaning whoever left them was heavy. And they weren't just in one place. They circled my tent. Someone had been walking around my campsite while I was asleep. A cold chill ran down my spine. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was no one in sight. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. My first instinct was to pack up and leave immediately, but a part of me didn't want to panic. Maybe it was an old footprint. Maybe someone had camped here before me, but the prints were fresh. The edges were sharp. And the worst part? They led away from my tent into the woods, but not back the way they came. Whoever it was had been standing near my tent in the middle of the night, watching, and then they left, moving deeper into the forest. I didn't hesitate after that. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, keeping my knife in my hand the whole time. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there. The hike back to my truck was the longest I've ever done. Every sound made my heart race. Every shadow felt like someone hiding. But I made it. I threw my gear into the truck, got in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had happened. Then I noticed something in the dirt by my truck. More footprints, barefoot, leading from the woods to my truck. Whoever had been at my campsite had followed me. They had watched me pack up. They had watched me walk back to my truck. And then they had disappeared. I drove out of there as fast as I could, not looking back. I don't camp alone anymore. I didn't think much of it when my friend Mark suggested a camping trip. It was something we did every few months. Pack up, drive into the woods, and disconnect from the world for a couple of days. No cell service, no people, just the quiet of the trees and a fire at night. This time, it was just the two of us. Our usual group had backed out: work, family, last-minute excuses. Mark was still set on going, though, and I figured, why not? We'd been camping enough times that it wasn't a big deal. We picked a spot about 4 hours from home, somewhere deep in the forest. Mark had found it online, a remote clearing that a few hikers had posted about, saying it was beautiful and untouched. No trails, no campsites, just a place where the trees opened up near a small lake. We left early, trying to get there before dark. The first few hours were just driving, the road getting worse the further we went. By the time we turned onto the last dirt road, it was barely more than a path, potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. Eventually, we got as far as we could by truck. The rest was on foot. We had about a 2-mile hike ahead of us, loaded up with our packs and supplies. It was peaceful at first, the kind of quiet that only deep woods can give you. No sounds of cars, no distant voices, just the wind and our footsteps crunching on leaves. The trees were thick, towering above us, making the sunlight feel dim even though it was still early. It took longer than expected to reach the clearing. The path wasn't as clear as we thought, and we had to backtrack a couple of times after losing it. When we finally stepped into the clearing, though, it was worth it. A wide open space, grass instead of dirt, and the lake just beyond, still and untouched. We set up camp near the tree line, about 30 yards from the water. The sun was getting low, so we got to work fast. Tent up, firewood collected, a fire going before the cold set in. As night fell, the temperature dropped fast. The fire was the only thing keeping the chill away. We sat around it, eating, drinking, talking about nothing in particular. The kind of simple conversations that happen when there's no phone in your hand, no distractions. At some point, I realized how quiet it was. No birds, no insects, just the crackling of the fire. The lake was completely still, no ripples, no movement. I didn't say anything about it. Didn't want to sound paranoid. The first sign that something was off happened just before we turned in for the night. I got up to take a leak, walking a few steps away from the fire. That's when I saw it. Footprints, not ours. They were fresh, leading from the trees toward our camp. I stared at them, my mind racing. They weren't boot prints, just the shape of feet, deep in the dirt, barefoot. I glanced back at Mark. He was still sitting by the fire, oblivious. I didn't say anything, just walked back and sat down, trying to shake the feeling crawling up my spine. The wind had picked up slightly, making the trees sway, branches creaking. The fire flickered, sending shadows jumping around us. We eventually crawled into our tents, the fire burning low. The cold seeped through the fabric, making it hard to get comfortable. I don't know how long I lay there before I heard it. A sound outside. Slow, deliberate steps. Not an animal. Not the random rustling of the wind. Footsteps. I held my breath, my ears straining. The sound stopped just outside the tent. I could feel my heart pounding. I wanted to call out to wake Mark up, but something told me not to. I lay there, frozen, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. I eventually drifted into a restless sleep, my body too exhausted to stay tense. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. Almost. The footprints were still there. More of them now circling our tents. And something was missing. A bundle of firewood we had stacked near the tree line was gone. Just gone. No drag marks, no scattered pieces. As if someone had picked it up and walked away with it. I told myself it was a bear. A dumb excuse, but one that kept my mind from going to darker places. Mark didn't seem to notice anything. He was already making coffee, acting like nothing was weird. I didn't bring it up. We spent the day hiking, exploring the area. It was beautiful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trees felt too still, the silence too unnatural. When we got back to camp in the evening, something was different. Our stuff had been moved. Not a lot, just small things. My backpack was unzipped, even though I knew I had closed it. The camping stove had been turned on but wasn't lit. Mark's boots were a few feet from where he had left them. We tried to laugh it off, said maybe we had done it without realizing it. But I could see it in Mark's face. He knew something was wrong too. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard something that made my blood go cold. Breathing, right outside the tent. Slow, heavy breathing. I gripped my knife, my hands sweaty. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The breathing stayed there for what felt like forever. Then, finally, it faded. Morning came. We didn't talk. We packed up and left. Fast. The hike back to the truck was silent. Every snapping branch, every rustling leaf made my heart jump. When we finally reached the truck, relief flooded me. We threw our stuff in and got in, slamming the doors shut. As I turned the key, my eyes flicked to the tree line one last time. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing between the trees, barely visible in the morning light, watching us, not moving, just watching. I slammed the gas, and we tore down the dirt road, not stopping, not looking back. We never went camping again. I don't even know how to start this. Thinking back to that night makes my hands shake, and I keep asking myself if I could have done something different. But I know I couldn't have. What happened happened, and I'm lucky to be here writing this. It started as just a normal camping trip. Nothing special. Just me, my brother Sam, and our friend Jake. We'd been talking about it for weeks, wanting to get away from work, the city, and just breathe in some fresh air. We weren't hardcore survivalists or anything, just three guys who liked to hike, drink by the fire, and talk about dumb things. The spot we chose was about 3 hours from home, deep in a forest neither of us had been to before. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing by a river that Sam found on an old hiking forum. There wouldn't be any bathrooms or picnic tables, but that was the point. We wanted to be out there, away from people, just us and the woods. The drive was long, and by the time we got there, the sun was already starting to dip. The road leading into the area was rough, mostly dirt, and full of potholes. My truck barely made it through without getting stuck, but eventually we pulled up to the clearing. It was perfect, a wide open space, surrounded by towering trees. The river was about 50 yards away, close enough to hear the water moving. It was quiet, too quiet actually. No birds, no rustling, just the wind and the river. I remember making a joke about how it felt like the start of a horror movie, but no one laughed. Not because they were scared, just tired. We started setting up camp right away. We brought 2 tents, one for me and Sam and one for Jake. It took longer than it should have, mostly because we kept messing around, drinking beers before we even got the fire going. By the time we finished, it was dark. The only light came from our fire and the moon hanging low above the trees. We sat around talking about work, relationships, dumb things we'd done in high school. The usual. I don't know how long we were sitting there before I started to get this weird feeling, like we weren't alone. I chalked it up to paranoia. We were in the middle of nowhere, so of course my brain was going to play tricks on me. But then Jake said something that made my stomach drop. Have you guys noticed the woods are too quiet? We all had. Normally, you'd hear crickets, birds, maybe even a few animals moving around. But there was nothing, just the crackling of our fire. We tried to brush it off, said maybe it was just the season, or maybe animals stayed away from humans. But I could tell none of us really believed that. We kept drinking, trying to shake the weird feeling. But then, at some point, we heard it. Footsteps. They were distant, coming from deeper in the woods. Slow, careful. Too careful, like someone was trying to move without making noise but wasn't quite good enough at it. I turned toward the sound, but of course, the firelight didn't reach that far. Just darkness and trees. What was that? Sam muttered, barely above a whisper. None of us answered. We just listened. The footsteps stopped. We stared into the dark for what felt like forever, waiting for another sound, waiting for anything. But nothing came. Eventually, Jake laughed, but it was forced. Probably just a deer. It didn't sound like a deer. A deer moves in quick bursts, hooves against leaves and twigs. This was different, but none of us wanted to admit that we were scared. So we nodded, laughed it off, and went back to drinking. I wish we hadn't. The rest of the night was fine, or at least nothing else happened. We crawled into our tents around 1 a.m., still a little buzzed, but not drunk enough to pass out right away. I lay there listening. Still no bugs. Still no wind. Just the river. At some point, I drifted off, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, convinced I heard something moving outside. I told myself it was just my imagination. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard something that made my blood go cold. A zipper. Not just any zipper, a tent zipper. My tent zipper. I stopped breathing. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would wake Sam. I felt the tiniest tug at the zipper, like someone was testing it, trying to be quiet. I wanted to call out, to say Jake's name, to see if maybe he was messing with us. But something in my gut told me not to. I just lay there, frozen, listening. The zipper stopped. Silence. I don't know how long I stayed like that. A minute? 10? An hour? I don't know. But eventually, I forced myself to close my eyes, telling myself I'd imagined it. Morning came, and everything felt normal again. Almost. Jake was already up, making coffee. Sam was still snoring. I stepped outside and stretched, trying to shake the uneasiness from the night before. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not boot prints. Bare footprints. They started near the trees and led straight to our tents. Right up to my tent. And then they stopped. No walking away, no turning back. Just stopped. I stared at them for what felt like forever. Jake noticed. "What are you looking at?" I didn't know what to say. I just pointed. He came over, coffee in hand, and the second he saw them, all the color drained from his face. We woke Sam up, packed up, and left. Fast. We didn't talk much on the way home. None of us wanted to say it, but we all knew. Someone was out there with us that night, watching, listening, waiting, and the worst part, whoever it was never walked away.